grasped Russia with the mind. For her no yardstick was created. Her soul is of a special kind, by faith alone appreciated. The order to murder the Tsar and his family came direct from Moscow on the 16th of July 1918. The family was taken to an empty basement room. The leader of the Chekists, the secret police, Yakov Yurovsky, read out the death sentence. In his memoirs he wrote,
Nicholas turned away from the firing squad and towards his family. Then, as if he had suddenly had a thought, he turned back and asked, "How? What?" The squad had already received instructions about who was to take aim at whom. The order was to shoot them straight in the heart in order to avoid unnecessary bloodshed and to get the matter dealt with as quickly as possible. Wordlessly, Nicholas turned back to his family. The others let out a few incoherent screams. The whole thing lasted only a few seconds. Then the first shots were fired. I shot at him and killed him right away.
He came to this terrible and bloody end because of the constant historical procrastination, because of the constant fear of change, and fear of the people. It was because of an incomprehension of the times. The last Tsar in particular did not hear the wind of change blowing.
Russian history is full of symbols. The murder of the Tsar and his family took place in Yekaterinburg, in the house of the merchant Ipatiev. More than 300 years earlier, another member of the Romanovs, a boyar family from Moscow, fled the chaos in the country and sought refuge in the Ipatiev monastery in Kostroma on the banks of the Volga. He was elected Tsar at the age of 16. Miniatures from the history of the Romanovs, painted by the contemporary artist Valentin Vukeyev, who has given the tradition of icon painting a modern interpretation by turning them into comic strips. Red Square in Moscow and a special monument. The inscription reads, "Dedicated to Minin and Prince Podsarsky." Minin and Podsarsky liberated the Russian capital from Polish invaders and plundering Cossacks in 1612. It was they who paved the way for the Romanovs. The Russians called the transition period from the 16th to the 17th century Smuta, time of troubles. It began with the death of Ivan the Terrible and ended with the election of the first Romanov as Tsar. The Russian people had been without a leader for almost 3 years before the young Mikhail Romanov was chosen, an unknown quantity. In 1613, the bells of the Kremlin cathedrals rang for days, announcing the election of the young Mikhail Romanov as Tsar. On the 11th of July, a jubilant crowd attended the coronation ceremony. Was he able to save Russia?
That's a difficult question, and one I've never been asked. When the Romanovs came to power, they didn't know about their mission. I'm certain of that. As a family, they just grabbed the power that they wanted. That brought them money and preeminence over people who were already privileged. To say that the Romanovs came to power to save Russia would mean giving them credit for something they knew nothing about.
Мне кажется, что начиная еще с Ивана Грозного и с великого...
I think the Civil War began during the time of Ivan the Terrible. There was always a civil war between those who sought Russia's modernization and those who wanted to live in the old way. The reformers imposed contact with the West on those with a backward attitude. To this day, one of Russia's main problems is that the majority of the population live in accordance with the traditional archaic principles.
The ancestral home of the Romanovs is in Moscow, just a stone's throw from the Kremlin. It's surrounded by the churches that made up Moscow's oldest sector. We're meeting Paul Kulikovsky, a direct descendant of the Romanovs.
Well, I'm the great-great-grandson of Emperor Alexander III, and he had, of course, one son that was Nicholas II that became emperor also. And the sister of him was Grand-Duchess Olga Alexandrovna. So she was the youngest daughter of Emperor Alexander III. And she married an officer of the guard, Nikolai Kulikovsky, and I'm then the great-grandson of Olga Alexandrovna and Nikolai Kulikovsky. And actually stayed in Russia until 1920 and was the last member of the imperial family to leave Russia. And from there they immigrated then through Europe to Denmark and later on to Canada. And then I'm born in Canada and was moved by my mother back to Denmark and lived there for many years, and now I'm here in Moscow in Russia, so actually I'm making the reverse trip of my great-grandmother. Right now we're in the Romanov boy house on Varvaka Street in Moscow. This is actually the house where the later Tsar Michael Fedorovich was born, so this is actually the house where the dynasty of the Romanov actually begins. The boyar was like the old nobility in old Russia before, let's say, the imperial time. Of course, later when Peter the Great came, he established a real nobility, but before that it was called boyars.
When we came to Moscow in 2008, one of our first walks took us here to Boyar House. We met the director of the museum, and when she saw Paul, she was very excited and said, "I immediately saw that you are a Romanov. You have such a similarity. There's no doubt about it." The boyars were the elite of medieval Russia. They were very educated. That's why it's no surprise that Mikhail Romanov, the first Tsar, came from a boyar family. His son Alexei wrote wonderful letters. According to historians, he had an excellent style. In addition, the boyars had always been advisors to the Tsars. They came together in a Boyar Duma, a collective decision-making council. That's why the first parliament was later also called the Duma. Russia had returned to its roots.
The Romanovs came to power by chance. Their dynasty emerged from the chaos. The key was the fear they spread. At the same time, there were brave people in society who overcame it. The empire started growing at the beginning of the 17th century. The borders extended further and further, to the Volga in the south, deep into Siberia in the east, to the sea in the north, and later to the west. Under the Romanovs' rule over a period of 3 centuries, the Muscovite Empire grew into a major European power, without stripping itself of its Asian Tatar origins.
You can talk about a central theme running through the 300 years during which the Romanov dynasty ruled in Russia. There are 3 main factors: Firstly, religion, which didn't develop in Russia. It was an orthodoxy that was frozen in time. Secondly, a huge country with the soft forms of colonization on the one hand, but very different peoples on the other. And thirdly, there's the huge, almost unpopulated expanse of Russia. These were the conditions under which the Romanovs started their reign.
The foundation of a new Russia began with Peter the Great. Russia turned towards Europe. That was a public acknowledgement that Russia was Europe's little sister and that it would learn from Europe. That was very important, both for the rulers and the people. Peter the Great basically said, look how the people in the Netherlands, England, and Germany can work. Look and learn everything you can learn. He was significant in that regard, even though he was very contradictory, which is true of all radical political leaders.
What thoughts were engraved upon his brow, what force concealed within, and in that steed, what fire. The words of Alexander Pushkin in his poem, The Bronze Horseman. All Russian school children know the verses off by heart. It's a tragic story. A minor official loses his bride in a flood and bemoans the hubris of the Tsar for building a city in these marshes. The Kremlin was the seat of the Russian Tsars until Peter the Great moved the capital to St. Petersburg. When Peter was just 10, he was witness to a bloodbath in the Kremlin. It was triggered by something between a family dispute and a political rebellion. A riotous band of soldiers devastated the Tsar's residence. 2 uncles and countless family friends were killed. Peter never forgot the scenes that he watched from the stairs of the Palace of Facets. He felt very different in the Kolomenskoye, the summer residence to the south of Moscow's city center, on a bend in the Moskva River. The elevated river banks are now a popular leisure destination for the people of Moscow. Peter spent some of his childhood and youth here. Here in the vast wooden palace, life was less constrained. Peter discovered his love of craftsmanship and of the water. It all started with a sailing boat, which the 16-year-old Peter took out on the Moskva. On this little boat, he dreamed of a Russian fleet and ice-free access to the sea.
Peter came to power. He was a unique character in Russian history and in the history of the Romanovs. He had very varied, unusual talents. He was a workaholic. He almost never slept. He learned different jobs. People said he was a Tsar and a carpenter, but he was also an engineer. And an executioner. He later even had his own son tortured. He embodies this terrible Asian and Russian wildness, a wildness coupled with a desire for modernization and the desire for Russia to become more European.
From Moscow to St. Petersburg. Peter had his new capital built on mud and bones, using tens of thousands of forced laborers. Nothing and nobody was spared to make his dream of sea access and a window to the west come true.
The story of St. Petersburg starts with the Peter and Paul Fortress, built during the Great Northern War. Peter the Great was fighting Charles XII of Sweden. A spot on Hare Island was found, and Peter and Paul Fortress was founded on the 16th of May, 1703. It was not at first built of stone, but of earthworks and wooden fortifications. This type of fortress was new for Russia, as it was built following a new French system. The difficulties in building the city mainly lay in the climate and in the terrain. It's a damp, cold city. Many inhabitants of St. Petersburg still regret that it wasn't built somewhere in the south. The marsh on which it was built has always caused significant problems. Posts were rammed into the marshy ground for large buildings. A lot of sand was needed. More than half of even this small island on which the fortress stands consists of sand, and that sand was brought here especially.
"25 members of the Romanov dynasty, including 12 Tsars, have found their final resting place in sarcophaguses in the Peter and Paul Cathedral. The magnificent tomb of Peter the Great is adorned with a bronze bust and plastic roses. Exactly 80 years after the murder of the last Tsar and his family, the mortal remains of Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra and their 5 children found a resting place in a side chapel of Peter and Paul Cathedral. 2 years later, the Russian Orthodox Church canonized the Tsar and his family. Two stories above the organ, the chief engineer of Peter and Paul Fortress shows us the best view of his city.
It's a quiet place. The higher you climb, the quieter it gets. Everything stays down below. When you come up here, you feel as if you could fly, and then you admire all this beauty. There was an interesting event in 1830. During a storm, the cross and the weather vane on the top of the belfry were damaged. Several suggestions were made for the repair, but they were all really expensive because there was no staircase inside the tower. The only way to get to the vane was by erecting scaffolding. But then the roofer, Pyotr Tyolushkin, offered to repair the vane with just the help of ropes. His suggestion was accepted. From the top window above us here, he crawled out onto the exterior of the tower and attached the rope. Then he wrapped the rope around the top of the belfry like a spiral, so he could get higher and higher. When he reached the weather vane, he lowered a rope. For 6 weeks, he climbed up the rope and repaired the vane. He was awarded a medal and 1,200 rubles in silver for this heroic deed. That was a fortune at the time. You could buy a village for that money. A cow cost 4 or 5 rubles. He was also given a silver beaker that he could take to any state-owned bar in the city and drink as much as he wanted. After this heroic deed, which he performed at the age of 24, he only lived for another 4 years. Then he had a fatal accident.
Russian history, the history of the Romanovs, is a bit like a tango. 1 step forwards, 2 steps back. Sometimes a massive step forwards, and then immediately 2 steps back. After Peter's death, these steps were almost too fast. The price was very high for Russia. Thousands died on the construction sites. The wars Peter waged also exhausted the population.
Peter was considered a merciless ruler. He developed the Tsardom into a major power. Now there is a huge monument in his honor in Moscow of all places, the city Peter hated. It's pure kitsch and not very popular with the locals.
This monument has caused a lot of anger among the people of Moscow for several reasons. The monument is a symbol of strong power. What does Peter stand for? For Russia's modernization. But it's also a symbol for the incredible dominance of the state over the people. Everything is subordinated to the benefit of the state. In modern-day Russia, where people are free, it conjures up this image that demonstrates nothing but power. The state has made a statement with that.
The state has made a statement, but the people aren't putting up with it anymore. Since Putin's re-election in 2012, the people of Moscow have taken to the streets. The demonstrators chant, "We're invincible as long as we're united."
I wouldn't compare Putin to a czar. His power is greater in some respects, because these days there are quite different opportunities and dimensions. I think that this protest movement arose because there are historical parallels. Because the people in power once again do not understand that Russia needs modernization, or what that would look like.
If you come into the sights of those in power and they don't like you, you're ruined. You're transformed from being a strong, independent person into a fearful person, and then into someone without a personality. Dostoevsky called that a trembling creature. There's no way of escaping the hatred of power. We saw that with Khodorkovsky and the completely absurd accusations against Pussy Riot, when hatred triumphed over justice. We saw it over the course of 2012, when repressive laws were passed. They came one after the other, as if from a money-printing machine.
The anger with the government can often only be dealt with through black humor.
In a dream, Putin asks Stalin to help him with these demonstrators and protesters. Stalin says, "Shoot the Democrats and paint the Kremlin blue." Why blue? Putin asks. Stalin says, I knew you wouldn't ask me about the first part.
Peter's daughter, Empress Elizabeth of Russia, ruled the country for 20 years. Remaining childless, she adopted the son of her sister Anna, Peter, Duke of Holstein-Gottorp. But he proved to be a disappointment. He's said to have been infantile, uncultivated and violent. A marriage was arranged to rescue the situation. The solution came from Germany. 15-year-old Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst entered the Petersburg stage in February 1744. And as Catherine the Great, she occupied that stage until the end of the century. But first she was just a wife of Peter III. She wasn't interested in her husband's affections, she cared more about the Russian crown. Peter III was Tsar for just half a year when she chased him from office with the help of the Imperial Guard. 7 days later he was killed. Before she became Empress, she had spent 17 years by his side as Grand Duchess. The Empress wanted fame and wanted to be considered the equal successor of Peter the Great. In St. Petersburg it is said that Catherine found the city of wood and left it a city of stone. That's why she's now seen as the second builder of the city, giving it an ancient Roman feel. At the end of the 18th century there were columns, pilasters and capitals all over the city. Her desire to build was unquenchable. In a letter she wrote,
"You know that the building efforts are raging here more strongly than ever, and no earthquake could have destroyed more houses than we build. Building is a disease, just like drinking, and it's a kind of habit, too."
Catherine the Great laid the foundation for what's probably the biggest museum in the world, the Hermitage. It's filled to the brim with paintings because, coupled with her fanatical building efforts, she also was an avid collector. In 1764 she had the small Hermitage and the old Hermitage built on the side of the Winter Palace facing the Neva River. Over a period of 30 years, Catherine had more than 3,000 paintings brought to St. Petersburg, including works by Rubens, Van Dyck, Raphael, Tizian, Watteau, Tintoretto and Veronese. However, when she beheld her artworks, she is said to have lamented,
"Only I and the mice can admire these treasures."
She would be happy today because now there's a never-ending stream of visitors making their way through the halls of the world-famous Hermitage. The monarch integrated Russia into the political and cultural landscape of Europe. She strengthened the Russian centralized state and reinforced the foundations of a major power. She was particularly delighted about military triumphs.
"If I could rule for another 200 years, the whole of Europe would be subordinated to the Russian scepter."
There was always the notion that Russia had to travel down a special path and that the West couldn't understand Russia, that Russia was completely unique. There are these famous verses by one of the best Russian poets, Fyodor Tyutchev, which are quoted pretty regularly. He spent a long time living in the West and wrote, "Who would grasp Russia with the mind? For her no yardstick was created. Her soul is of a special kind, by faith alone appreciated."
The reign of Paul I, Catherine's son, was short and seen as a reign of terror. He fell victim to a conspiracy. The change of ruler caused great joy in Russia. The new Tsar, Catherine's grandson Alexander I, took power in 1801. But the wife of a French minister wrote,
"The new Tsar walks in the footsteps of the murderer of his grandfather, followed by the murderer of his father, and he's surrounded by his own murderers.
European civilization arrived with the German women that the Tsars kept marrying. With Napoleon and his expansionist and aggressive politics, civilization disappeared again. In June 1812, French troops marched into Russia. The Russian army was far outnumbered by the French. Tsar Alexander I ordered his troops to wage a war of attrition. His aim was to have the invaders suffer under the expanse and the climate of the country. At the beginning of September 1812, the French army had managed to get to Borodino, 80 kilometers to the southwest of Moscow. One of the toughest and bloodiest battles in history occurred, and the French won. Napoleon stood outside Moscow and waited for the keys to the gates to be handed over to him. But nobody came. The 240,000 inhabitants had fled. Fire broke out in several places. 6,500 homes burned, and there were no provisions in the city. Napoleon had to leave the burning Kremlin. When the first snow fell at the end of September, he started his retreat through a ravaged country. Napoleon's army fell apart. The Russian Empire rose to the status of Europe's savior, and the map of Europe was redrawn.
Nicholas II closed the door of the monarchy. He was the first Romanov to capitulate, and it's no accident that he was the last, because he was the most emotional ruler of them all. If you're very emotional as a monarch, and you carry such a great burden as this country, then it's dangerous. He was like a fragile train that had to pull a very heavy load. That's impossible. Nicholas II was an over-emotional, very sensitive person. He had to capitulate.
A formative event for Nicholas was the attack on his grandfather Tsar Alexander II. On the 1st of March 1881, the 12-year-old Nicholas came home to the Winter Palace, what's now the Hermitage, after skating on the Neva. He was still holding his ice skates. He was taken to his grandfather, who was bleeding to death. This experience stayed with the young Tsarevich his whole life.
The history of the Romanovs is a lesson for us, a lesson for Russia. They spent 300 years breaking the laws they themselves passed. During these 300 years, there were murders and conspiracies. There was a rupture break between the people and those in power. And so the revolutionaries killed, of all people, the Tsar who liberated the peasants. That's a historical injustice.
Ballet was part of the Russian courtly tradition. The Russian imperial ballet had been a firm component of the courtly tradition since the 18th century. The Tsars and Grand Princes frequently fell for the dances. In 1890, Nicholas confided in his diary,
"I like Ksheshinskaya a lot."
Matilda Ksheshinskaya was a member of the imperial ballet. Her success was based on her grace and her expressiveness, which captivated audiences. But the affair didn't progress as rapidly as the prima ballerina's career. The Romanovs sent their son on a world trip for almost a year. After his return, the two ran into each other in the Mariinsky Theatre. A short while later, an affair lasting almost 2 years began between the heir to the throne and the dancer. But as the future Tsar, Nicholas had to marry someone befitting his rank. His choice fell, as was so often the case in his family, on a German, Alix of Hesse-Darmstadt. She had to convert to the Orthodox Church and was given the name Alexandra Fyodorovna. In October 1894, his father, Tsar Alexander III, died. Nicholas was only 26 and didn't feel prepared to rule. He took over a country whose realities he knew almost nothing about. He confided in a cousin,
"I don't understand anything about matters of state. I don't even know how to talk to ministers. I never wanted to be Tsar."
Moscow in 1896, more than 1,000 people died during the huge celebrations in honor of Nicholas's coronation, a tragedy and a bad omen. Nicholas II was now the most powerful man in the world, ruler over more than 170 million people and an empire reaching from the Baltic to the Pacific, but he didn't understand his country's dilemma. The writer Leo Tolstoy wrote a letter to the Tsar complaining about moral decay.
To summarize the general state of the people: haggard children, degenerate tribes, people and animals sharing living spaces, uninterrupted numbing work, servility, dejection. And on the other hand, nothing but self-interest, ambition, pomposity, and a desire for power and influence.
Nicholas firmly continued his father's conservative policies. Russia was a state of extreme contrasts. While the arts, sciences and industry flourished, politically the country was stuck in the past, in absolutism. 80% of the population lived in rural locations, in poverty and grime. The court and the aristocracy celebrated glittering parties, far away from the millions of starving peasants. Unlike the European states, Russia had neither a parliament nor a constitution at the start of the 20th century. After the Russo-Japanese War, the metal workers in St. Petersburg went on strike in January 1905. The peaceful worker demonstrations, with more than 100,000 participants, went to the Winter Palace with a petition for the Tsar. 200,000 were out singing religious songs. Then the order to fire was given. Many people were killed. The 9th of January went down in history as Petersburg's Bloody Sunday. Alexander Palace in Tsarskoye Selo became a more and more important place of retreat for the Tsar's family. When the country started drowning in chaos, threatening the throne, Nicholas made concessions. After hesitating for a long time, he gave the people the right to free speech and free assembly, and he went through with political reforms. The manifesto that finally granted the country a parliament, a Duma, was read out in the great throne room of the Hermitage. But the changes couldn't be felt at court. There was to be a terrible awakening from the dream in white. The last Tsar cared more about fun and games than about his country and government. Nicholas and Alexandra had chosen a way of life that was unknown at the Russian court. Their private life was more important to them than anything. They still went on excursions together. The family was still cheerfully bathing naked in Peterhof. In many ways, 1905 was a crucial year for the empire of the last Tsar. Nicholas II wrote in his diary on the 1st of November,
"I have made the acquaintance of a man of God, Grigory from the Tobolsk governorate."
The man was Grigory Rasputin, who would gain a devastating influence over the Tsarina in the following years. He helped manage the illness of her son, the Tsarevich.
She believed in Rasputin's omnipotence. One question is, why did she need Rasputin? I think that he helped the Tsarevich Alexei and reduced his suffering. But that's not all. She needed him as a psychologist. Her situation was very complicated. She married Nicholas and had 4 daughters in a row. But what did that mean for the monarchy? The first daughter, great. The second daughter, fine. The third and fourth daughters, what's happening?
Первая девочка, ура, хорошо. Вторая девочка, ну нормально. Третья, как-то. Четвертая.
The main job of a tsarina is to bear an heir to the throne.
Императрица – это родить наследника.
She did finally have him, but he was very sick. Alexandra was very stressed beforehand, but afterwards she became hysterical and neurotic.
Не вполне в хорошем состоянии, а уж после этого явно ее
Today, we would have called out a psychoanalyst to calm her down.
Мы бы назвали сегодня психоаналитик, который ее бы успокоил.
I think Rasputin took on that role.
Психоаналитика играл Распутин.
For the celebrations of the 300th anniversary of the House of Romanov in May 1913, the Tsar had himself and his dynasty staged magnificently in the Kremlin in Moscow. Tens of thousands of spectators crowded onto the boulevards. International statesmen came to the reception, as did the European aristocracy. The country's boom was breathtaking. The Russian Empire was resplendent. A reason to celebrate. But the peace was deceptive. The empire's luster disappeared over the next 4 years. The 2nd of August 1914, one day after Germany declared war on Russia, Tsar Nicholas II read out a manifesto to his people and showed himself on the balcony of the Winter Palace to the waiting crowds. Alone, he faced the people, who on this day weren't waving anti-Tsarist flags and slogans, but icons and portraits of the Tsar. For a short moment in history, a common enemy united the Tsar and his subjects. The enemy was Germany, the country of the Tsarina and all the dear relatives.
Первая мировая война была чудовищным, я бы сказала...
Entering the First World War was a terrible mistake, an unparalleled act of short-sightedness by the German and Russian monarchies. They were related. They were cousins, and they were fighting. Without this war, things wouldn't have come to such a dreadful end. The regime wouldn't have been toppled.
Такого страшного конца, такого обвала, такой крови.
The Romanovs paid for their mistakes with a lot of blood. They didn't see the looming danger.
А война, вот эта вот первая война, она вскрыла, война же всегда это, она
The First World War revealed all the contradictions and conflicts of the system and heightened them. It dragged on. And all that led to the terrible end of the dynasty.
At
the start of the war, there was an anti-German sentiment. It's also known that Rasputin was against the war. The Tsarina was German. There was treason. There were incredible rumors about a direct connection between Tsarskoye Selo, the village of the Tsars, and the German general staff. That shook the country and stoked the fire.
The war became the catalyst of dissatisfaction. The soldiers wanted bread and peace. Those were the slogans of the revolution. But arms production was still going ahead full steam.
The crisis that was caused primarily by World War I was a crisis of power, a dynastic crisis. It didn't arise suddenly. It was also Rasputin who influenced the events. And it was a weak monarch, Nicholas, who went to the headquarters on the front line in September 1915. That was the first fateful decision, in my opinion.
Rasputin became the bane of the Tsar and his family. He gained more influence at the court than all the ministers and military personnel together. He exploited the Tsar's absence and tried to gain political influence by writing letters to the Tsarina. But history could no longer be halted. In February, soldiers stormed the Winter Palace, which is now part of the Hermitage.
Russia's tragedy and the tragedy of the Romanovs consisted in them always being too late. That's why this knot of contradictions and conflicts formed in 1917.
It's a fact that over the past 100 years, we lost our values twice, our human ones and our national ones, once in 1917 and the second time in 1991 with the fall of the Soviet Union.
The diaries of Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra are preserved in the State Archive of the Russian Federation. On the 2nd of March 1917, the Tsar wrote,
"It is necessary that I abdicate. The crux of the matter is that it's necessary to take this step to save Russia."
The Tsar signed the abdication manifesto on the 2nd of March 1917. After that, he went to Tsarskoye Selo to his family, who by this point were being held captive. With that, more than 300 years of Romanov power came to an end. The vacuum was first filled by a democratic provisional government that emerged from the previous Duma.
In 1917, after the abdication, there were ideas about what was to be done with the Tsar. A good solution would have been for him to leave the country, but Nicholas didn't want to. The family was naive and thought that everything had been taken care of with the abdication. They thought they could live in Livadia on the Crimean. That would have met Nicholas's needs. For more than 20 years, he had suffered under the burden of his position as head of a great empire. He wasn't up to the task.
After 300 years, Russia was without a Tsar for the first time. The emblems of the Tsar's power were destroyed all over the country. Lenin turned Russia upside down and determined the fate of the Romanovs. In August 1917, Nicholas was taken to Siberia with his family. First to Tobolsk, and then in spring 1918 to the Ipatiev house in Yekaterinburg. Cut off from the outside world, the entire family were murdered in the cellar of the Ipatiev house on the 16th of July 1918. There are around 60 Romanovs still living around the world today. Almost all of them are descendants of the sisters of the last Tsar, Ksenia and Olga. One of them is Paul Kulikovsky, a great-grandson of Olga.
There has been some attempts to try to bring back the family here and there, but so far it's not really been, let's say, successful. There was an attempt under Boris Yeltsin to bring back the family, but at the last moment he decided not to go through with that project. So up till now, it actually only been that, of course, people are very happy that we come and visit and we participate in historical events and some other ceremonial events. But really to come back and stay here, it would be on private initiative if it's to happen.
It's like with football. Everyone plays for himself. Nicholas I played against Europe. Alexander II played for Europe. Alexander III played against Europe. Nicholas II played for Europe. Lenin and Stalin played against Europe. Khrushchev started moving towards Europe. Brezhnev moved away from Europe. And finally Gorbachev came to Europe and Putin fled from Europe. That's Russian history. The result is incomprehensible because all the people in power have played against themselves. It's a game with just one team on the pitch, putting the ball first in one net and then in the other.